corner here, right? And I did, right? And I caught myself for about 10 to 20 minutes just rationalizing in my mind why what I was doing it was so much nicer than the other people were doing. And why, in all senses, what I was doing was totally fine, with the exception that everyone else is totally wrong, right? And when I caught myself doing that, I realized kind of, nothing happens by chance, right? This has happened in the last week or so. So I was preparing for this lecture. I'm like, see, thank you for the example, God. That works really well. I'm going to use that. Thank you. So obviously, I kind of started to rationalize again. And I've been thinking about it. It's like, why do we do this, right? And it's, again, part of, things we do without thinking, right? It's in our auto mode, right? We press a button, this automatic, not autopilot. Our autopilot, right, Daniel?
Yeah.
We try to think that, you know, we're so much better, right? We shouldn't be judged the same way, right? And we spend a lot of time doing that. There's many other examples. I'm pretty sure you guys can think about it, but I have a good number of them, right? But even in tiny little things, right? You can think about that same scenario happening, right? So in this chapter in the Gospel according to Spiritism, chapter 10. So the name of the chapter is "Blessed Are the Merciful," right? And there's this passage also that we know for a fact, like we all know this passage, right? We all know the story of the woman, right, that was brought to Jesus, right, committing adultery, all right, that people wanted to stone her to death. That was the tradition at the time, right? Many males, some females too, but this is obviously a male dominant situation, society that we still have, right? But not a lot of things not changed so much compared to last time. Like very harsh judgment against the mistake of someone else, although we themselves at that time, I was probably there incarnated in stoning someone at that time. I'm pretty sure I was doing that too, right? We're probably thinking like, I'm in such an elevated moral state that I feel the capacity and the ability to judge someone and stone them because of whatever they've done, right? So Jesus, in an incredible teaching moment, right, tells that, well, if there's and he says that if there's anyone here that is completely never done a mistake in their lives and feel that they have the capacity to judge this person, go ahead, throw the first stone, right? No problem. Because they were expecting Jesus to, ride a fine balance between, following what was considered to be the laws at the time, but also at the same time not supporting that judgment of stoning someone. That's the fine line, right, that we're looking at the time. And obviously, everybody walked away, right? No one, how it ended, right? And Jesus said, "Woman, where are your accusers? Had not only them, like, have you any of them condemned you? No. So neither will I. So go ahead in the future and sin no more." And the concept that don't make mistakes again, or at least learn with them, right? So you don't have repeating them all the time, right? So why is this important, right? We can unpack a lot here, right? So we can unpack the concept that we judge others in a very different way than we try to judge ourselves, right? We have a concept of the society at the time, and the idea of misogyny, right, and treating others differently because of different religious beliefs, or different of sex and gender and all of this, right? This happened at that time too, right? It's just the difference that people didn't talk about it, right? I think one of the clear evolutions of our society nowadays, at least we can talk about it, right? Although the fact that we still treat people differently, yep, it happens every day, but at least you can have a conversation about it. And in a way, we're evolving a little bit, right? Now that's when I want to bring some concepts that I apply constantly, right? When we're doing research, right, at the university, right? So those are the four concepts that I really want to bring into this. The idea of prejudice, stereotype, bias, and discrimination, right? Those four things, they kind of work together, okay? And I'll try to distill them, right? So we know our own biases and unconscious biases, and then use that to explain why what we're looking at here in the stories that Jesus is presenting is a lot of that. Those four concepts are ingrained into that religious concept too. So they're all connected, okay? So let's start with basics then. So starting with stereotype. So stereotype, by definition, is when we use a very simplistic or simplified, standardized belief of groups and people. In other words, it's like, I have a belief about an individual or a group of individuals, and I try to categorize them in a very simplified way, right? Instead of taking context everything, I just look at someone's color of skin and I automatically put that into a bin, right? That I stereotype it. In other words, everyone that looks like this, right, as part of this particular group, right? That will be a stereotype. Now, this is kind of interesting because this is how our brain, and I'm going to science, like this is how our brain works. I'll give you an example. Like if you're in the summer and you look at the window outside and it's sunny, so you don't think about, oh, let me do a research about what do I need to wear now, right? You don't do that, right? Why? Because you see sun and it's summer, it's going to be hot. Your brain's doing that for you. So just little bins, right, of information. So we take a very complicated situation and turn into a binomial or dichotomous scenario, like either this or that, right? So now if you do the same and it's winter, your brain is not going to be thinking about, should I go out and check the temperature, look if my receptors in the skin will be offset about the increased degrees temperature. Is this appropriate? Are you going to do a research about it? No. So you look outside and it's sunny and it's January, it's cold, right? So you're going to have to pack and put a jacket on, right? So that is the idea of categorization or bins, right, that our brain creates. This is part of that's how we live, right? Because we have to process a ton of information very fast in a very accurate way. Now, what happens sometimes we use that same thing for people and groups and society, right? That's where the idea of stereotypes comes from, right? Now, the prejudice comes then when after we categorize people into groups, we assign preconceived opinions about that group, right? In the stereotype, I've organized them, right? And then in the prejudice, I start to actually preconceive the information and attach it to that group, right? So this particular group, stereotype, I put into that bin, and that bin means that, right? So that's when I started to put the idea of the prejudice in place. So prejudice by itself does not mean if I don't act on it, it doesn't lead to bias. So the bias comes now when I take people, I categorize them, I attach something to them, this preconceived ideas that I have, right? But then that leads to unequal treatment. Now I start to separate that, right? So that is bias. So in other words, I look at someone, I assign maybe on the how tall, how, height or weight or sex orientation, whatever. So I organize them into a bin. I categorize that bin as that group of individual. And now I start to treat that differently, right? In an unequal way, right? That's the bias. And then discrimination is that when that bias results into that your behavior reflects that bias. In other words, now I actually start to treat people differently or decide things differently, right? Or discriminate based on all those concepts that I brought together, right? Again, one needs the other, right, to work. Otherwise, it's almost like a linear development. Okay. Now, if you take all that back to now, I'm going to do this interesting analysis of go back to the woman that's being stoned in Jesus' time, right? So at that time, what is a stereotype, right? Stereotype is that a woman, to start with, right, that is actually not submissive to a husband, right? Big one, right? So now there's already a huge stereotype. It doesn't matter if she's actually having sex with other people or not. But the fact that she's not in the house being submissive to a man, by definition, puts that into the stereotype of being whatever you want to call them, like a prostitute or whatever, right? So it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter anymore, right? Because they already have that stereotype set up, right? Now they start to assign the prejudice to that stereotype is that, well, if the woman is into this bin, then automatically that's negative, right? Because that's not our tradition. And then I take that prejudice now and say, well, now I have a bias because that is different than everyone else. I treat them poorly. I treat her differently, right? She's against the accepted majority group, right? And then we discriminate by saying, well, you're wrong, you're going to be punished, right? See, that's a great example of prejudice, stereotype, bias, and discrimination, right? In action, right? And Jesus basically counteracts that entire philosophical thought by just asking people to think about themselves, right? That's the only thing he asked. He didn't say anything about law and didn't give a speech about, what are the norms of culture at that time. He didn't want to get into that because that will have its own prejudice, bias, and discrimination again. So you're going to reincite people, opposing groups of philosophical thought, right? Say, oh, but I believe that. No, I believe this. We still have that in science. We still have people believe that races exist. We have people talking to other people about races in humanity. Humans. It does not exist. So the genetic differences between people with two different skin tones is so minute that I can have the same skin tone of another person and have more generic variability than another person with the black or white skin, doesn't matter, right? And that is not manifested by any measurable genetic characterized race. It doesn't exist, right? So those differences are non-existent. They don't exist, right? So the differences between us and a mouse are probably, what? Less than 1% of our genome, right? It's like 0.1% probably, right? So this is like we're stuck into concepts that mean nothing, right? So people still talk about it. So what is that? That's the prejudice. Come from the stereotypes, right? Typical, right? Or the way people look. We'll go through some examples of that, right? You still have, and we're going to get examples in a minute about how does that play in our common society. So now going back, now if you can almost get, and I spent some time doing this, but almost every passage that I read after I started to apply these ideas, these concepts, you can find some clear evidence of that same trend from all the way from stereotype to discrimination into daily actions at that same level in the previous society 2,000 years ago. So in a way, we're still into that mode. And now Jesus and particular Spiritism is helping us counteract that in a very elegant way by, in a simple, logical way, just that, have you actually thought about yourself? That's the same experiment that I did when I was walking my dog, right? But our mind tricks us because it's painful to realize that we're actually wrong. It's painful. It's not easy. We have this interesting ego and then this protective layer around our ego, right? That prevents us from tipping into it and realizing that, well, this layer that I created around my ego is actually what makes me live, right? And behave and show to people this is who I am, right? But reality is right in there. There's a lot more to dissect, right? So, but that's what Spiritism does. He said, you know what? Let's do this reflection. Let's go back, right? Know yourself. Have you heard about that? So that's the concept, right? How can we apply that, right, on a day-to-day basis, right? So that's kind of some of the ideas that I'm going to just start to think about today, right? So let me give you now some of those examples of how am I going to keep changing this. So how do we change this, right? So that's the idea of the be kind, compassionate, right, comes in. That's exactly what we need to start working on, right? So we know that, when Jesus asked, when he was asked, like, how many times we forgive, right? He brings this 7 times, 2 times, 10 times, right? And then Jesus says 70 times 7. In other words, like, it doesn't matter what the number, right? It means like it's a lot, right? So that has to be very clear, right? So some of the examples about this, and there's some very interesting ones, right? So Harvard University created this thing called the implicit association test. And I have to say, I took it several times because I found it incredibly interesting. Some of them will give you a result right away. There's different tests, but it shows you how much bias you have, implicit bias, right? I did one that I found interesting. So, well, that's part of my research background, not necessarily here, but I like to connect them because I think they're spiritism and what I do in science, they're ingrainedly connected, right? This implicit association test basically is based on something that we call the Stroop phenomenon, Stroop test. So that's an association mechanism that our brain creates between images and colors and concepts and words and what we see and what we think, right? So the concept of the test is very interesting. So in most cases, the test will actually bring you some images or scenarios, and you have to associate words with that scenario, right? And it calculates the time it takes you to do that, and the corrected, like how often you correct on that association, right? So there's 2 different variables it takes in, and by analyzing those variables, it determines how much bias you have into that particular scenario that you presented. So there's one that I find, the one that's well known. There's millions of tests done. So they save all that data, and it's free. You can go in online and go to the implicit project, I think they call it, but it's called the implicit association test, and Harvard maintains the entire project. So you can go in, register, and actually take it, right? And then when you take it, you're registering to research that uses that test. So there's an enormous amount of data available to evaluate, right? And one that's actually running for a long time is the idea of people with a white face and a black face. In other words, like skin color, right? And there's many tests done into that. And one of the tests, there's actually over 3 million responses, right? And it's very simple. What they've done is they allowed people to associate good words like happy, kind, and all that with images of someone that's white and someone who's black, right? And versus bad words or negative words, I say not bad words, but negative words, right? Like anger, hysterical, or something, right? And by analyzing that relationship, they've clearly repeated millions of times that people tend to associate negative words with a black face, right? Someone who's black. And nice words with someone who has a white skin, right? An image of someone with a white face. Now, they also did the reverse test. They actually analyzed, for them, one of the exercises was actually for you to forcibly associate good words to black faces. In other words, like the exercise was like associate this words with the black faces, and you have to sort them, right? It took much longer for people to do that versus the ones associated good words with white face. In other words, they had to really carefully think through this. It's not natural, right? By analyzing that delay in time, they also showed a constant bias, right, between us judging association words, right? They did the same thing for sexual orientation, for example, right? By showing images that relate to a same-sex relationship or gays, right? Versus the words and how do you match them. And it's pretty evident. The results show that associate negative words to same-sex relationships. And it could be, the images are, so some images, for example, is like a cake, like a wedding cake with 2 male mannequins on top, that was associated with the more negativity, right? They did that. Another one that I found very interesting is that there's this study. They decided to analyze how law students were being reviewed or evaluated by teachers right? And that's kind of where some of what I need to train for comes from, because I'm evaluated for a lot of things, so I need to make sure that I'm not biased, right, against certain things, right? So, but they did that study, and basically they submitted essays which were identical to a bunch of reviewers, right? The only difference in the essays, or the law, they call memos, right? The law memos from lawyers, right, from students, right? So the only difference is that one had a picture of a black student, and the other one has a picture of a white student, right, on the submitted documents, right? And they all reviewed the identical text, like no changes, right? So they had some mistakes in there intentionally placed in, and they numbered the mistakes, right? So when they submitted the essay for the black student, they detected 87% of the mistakes. When they submitted the same essay with a white student, they detected 52% of the mistakes. In other words, there's a huge implicit bias, right, just by looking at the image of who submitted it. But not only that, the study also evaluated, there's a comment box, and the comment box for the white students were typically like, great job, well done, I'll offer you a position. And the comment section for the black student was like, work harder, this is okay, you get there, kind of thing, so very negative feedback, right? And again, this identical, and what's funny though is like the background of the reviewer did not matter. It could be a black reviewer, a white reviewer, or anything. In other words, these biases are inherent to all of us, right? There's so many. So there's another study looking at the height of CEOs, right? CEOs in America average 6 feet. The average American is 5'9". And then they looked at the distribution of individuals who are in position of power. Not only they're males, they're white, but they're taller. So even that is actually an inherent bias, right? For us as a society, right? When we're selecting those candidates, right? And there's so many studies. There's like studies showing, for example, if someone is overweight, like in the picture resume, they're not selected for interviews, right? If it's black and white, or if it's like, if there's tattoos or not, like there's so many biases, right? And this website, keeps record of all of that, right? Now, why am I saying all of this, right? Because if we go back to, to Spiritism, what we're talking about today, a whole lot of what we're trying to dissect from the teachings of Jesus, right, involves some implicit bias from us, right? And our implicit bias obviously can be improved, right? First of all, when we recognize what they are. So we recognize they actually do have biases, right? So we can actually fix them. And we typically fix them by working through our own actions of, kindness, forgiveness, all of those things that are important, that the religious component of Spiritism brings to us, right? So how can we fix that, right? So I'm gonna bring more science. Sorry, guys. It's gonna be almost like a lecture at the university today. Okay, but I like to bring this out. So there's a study called "Do Good, Live Well" study, right? And this is well known study. Okay, so it's an online survey. They've looked at over 4,000 participants, right, in the United States, right? And they looked at, for example, like hours of volunteer hours, right? And whether how many hours of volunteer they would do over a year, right? And then they looked at whether there's a relationship between how many hours you're volunteering versus other factors, for example, how happy you are, kind of thing, right? So 92% of people who are volunteering say that it enriches their sense of purpose in life, right? 89% improve their sense of well-being, 73% lower the stress levels, 96% makes me happy. Like if we're looking at a pandemic of lack of happiness, right? For lack of a better word, of unhappiness, right? So one of the easy antidotes is actually serving. Where did we hear that? Oh, Jesus, for Christ, right? Jesus. Yes, he told us that 2,000 years ago in super easy terms, but we don't get it, right? And then has to come a study now to say, well, look, actually you serve people, actually you feel better physically, like you're healthier, right? And you do much better as a person, right? So if you think about, and then they do a nice relationship between all these different variables, right? But the bottom line is like the more you serve, the more you feel happy, healthy, live longer, right? And in general becomes more resilient to stressful situations, and you judge less, right? That's the whole concept of today, right? The idea of judging and punishment, right? So there's another study that is super cool. Well, this study they've looked at, this published in 1980 in Science, and this is a huge study. Particularly, like I do a lot of animal research, like mice and rats and stuff, and then this study, people have this stereotype and prejudice and bias against laboratory rats, right? I don't know. People think about rats like, oh, so yucky, right? Rats are amazing animals. They're like little cats. Like you play with them and they bond with you. They're really cool animals to work in a lab. Obviously, like in street rats, they're a little bit more dirty, but they're actually great animals too, right? Although we have a huge bias against them, right? Yes, true. Okay, so they did a study that they've had two groups of rats. Like one group of the rats had they had the same settings and all that, but one group was cared for by the same technician who talked to them, pat them, cared for them, just super nice to them, right? And the other group not, right? So what they found out at the end is like pretty much all measures of the health status of those animals were better in the group that the one caring for them was kind. Now, see, we're not even talking about humans here anymore. This is like a rat in a lab, right? But just the fact that we're being kind to them, the animals were much better, like glycemic levels and all that, right? So that changed a lot the way we treat those animals, right, in the lab completely, right? But also for us, like, now we have very organized light on, light off times, temperature, caring procedures. We're very worried about those influences, right, that are beyond like just giving them this food or that food, right? What we do in the lab, right? The study now, I think they found that the subgroup had 60% less atherosclerosis plaques, right, in the arteries, right, in the group, even though they ate the same diet. So a group of animals has 60% less coronary disease and atherosclerosis just by the fact that they were being kind to them, right? What it could do on us, right? Think about it, right? So how can we make all of us healthier? Be kind, right? It's fact. This is not hocus pocus, dark magic out there that people talk about. It's like, oh, no, it's not a religious concept that is completely out in the air. No, it is not, right? This is what I want to bring, like in a very clear way, right? This is real. This is truth, right? And we have to start working on this, right? So there's more studies. So there's a study that looked at. This is a nice study too by Schwartz in 2003. So look at altruistic behavior, kindness, right, to individuals in a mental health facility, right? So they looked at a sample of 2,000 members of a church, right, in the United States. And the purpose was to investigate whether altruistic behaviors, right, of helping others were associated with better physical and mental health, right? So after adjusting for all the potential variables, right, age and life events, income, health, and all of that, they found that the ones helping benefited a lot more from the ones receiving help, right? So being kind allowed them to actually significantly associated with better health outcomes, both mental health and physical health, right? Again, this is real. It happens. It's measurable, right? It's not that Jesus told us to be kind to others. No, no, this is like fact now, right? And we're still debating it, right? So there's so many. There's a lot of other studies that we can go through, but pretty much in almost every one of them, the concept of being kind and practicing charity has led to improved outcomes, right? It's like Matthew said, right? Matthew wrote, right? But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them, the ones that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them who despitefully use you and persecute you. So the concept that get rid of all that energy that we keep piling on inside of us, right? Get rid of it. It's not helping you. Not helping, right? I know we're not talking about, oh, every time you see someone doing something wrong, I'm just going to sit down and pray and everything will be fine. No, right? It's not going to work, right? Because we still live in a society that there are rules and we have to follow rules, and sometimes we have to act on things, right? But what is the intent behind your actions? That's the big question, right? Are we really trying to protect people to be safe, or are we just externalizing our own frustrations and bias and judgment when we're doing that, right? You think, right? I don't need to think about. I mean, I have my own that I'm working on, right? Each one of us have their own, right? Forgiving, right? It's an act of kindness, right? So should we forgive how many times? I don't know. Forgive a lot of times, right? Because we also want to be forgiven, right? That's the concept. That's what exactly Jesus brought to us that time. That's exactly what Jesus told to the woman, right? That's about to be stoned, right? So who's judging you, right? Our conscience are judging us for sure, right? Because we have this ingrained memory of what the divine laws are. And every time we deviate from the divine laws, there's going to be a little bit of a pushback, right? It may take a long time. It may take us coming back to this planet to incarnate several times, but we need to move, right? We need to move. And obviously Luke also writes that same sentence, right? Same passage Luke writes it too, saying, do not judge, right? Because you'll be judged, right? Be careful how you condemn, because you're also going to be condemned, right? That's where we're living right now in our society. But at least now we can think about it and we can talk about it, which, at that time, if you talked about it, you've been stoned too, right? With the same person, right? Because you're part of it, right? So we proved, right, in a way, right? Instead of being eaten by lions in a circus, now we just get bad comments on an Instagram post, right? So I think we improved a little bit, right? But the concept's still there, right? So that's what I'm trying to say, right? So the whole concept of the stereotype, prejudice, bias, and discrimination, and how we deal with it still exists, right? But obviously in a less aggressive way in some cases, not every case. Some people still die because of this, right? Right. So what do we do then? So we know that the recipe is it's pretty straightforward, right? So be kind, think about forgiveness, think about putting in practice, like reviewing kind of what you think, your own prejudices, like your own biases, and how we manifest in that on a daily basis, right? And then obviously, Allan Kardec is going to say this very well-known sentence, right? That says the true spiritists are recognized by their moral transformation and the efforts they make to overcome their evil inclinations. So it's the effort. That's what we're still missing, right? Because now if we do a survey anywhere, like almost anywhere in North America, if we do a survey and ask those concepts that we talked about, ask about your biases, ask about what we need to do, like things that can make you better. Everyone was going to write something that's reasonable, right? I don't think everyone's going to say, no, we got to kill everyone all the time. Like, no, like we should have that, but it's a tiny percentage now, right? I think most people are reasonable enough. They'll say, yeah, we got to do better, we got to help others. And, those are concepts that are ingrained in a society, but they're not acted on very often, right? I think the transition in times comes from Jesus shocking people not to stone someone because of the same concepts. to now people are like, oh, okay, this exists. I have to think about it. Now to the next step was like, okay, I got to do something about it, right? So this is it, right? And you can call it whatever you want. If you can call it planetary transition, all the fancy terms, like you can bring those terminologies, but in the end, all comes back to us inside of you, right in there, right? How are we dealing with those concepts? How are we making things better, right? I can give you another example. So there's this book by Dr. Goldberg. It's called The Power of Kindness, right? So he was an ER doctor in the United States for about 30 years, and he started to think about kind of he's doing his job and saving people coming to the ER, but he was thinking about the concept of kindness on a day-to-day basis with his experiences with like some patients coming in and some for example homeless people coming in or wealthy people coming in and how to help one another, how analyzing his work in the view of the concept of kindness, right? And he actually decided to explore the world to learn what makes you kind, right? It's a very interesting book. And from all places, he goes to Sao Paulo, right? And then when he goes to Sao Paulo, he meets Shayla, which is and her son, and they started, and she, like he describes in a very nice way, she like shows empathy and very kind, positive. Like you see that nice vibe when you get to someone like that, and like you connect instantly, right? So he connects, and what she does basically, she gives voice and understands. She talks and listens to homeless people, right? And of homeless people, we have a lot of them here too, right? And it's going up, not here, everywhere, right? And I don't want to judge, right? But I want you to think about this. How often do you actually see them? I don't mean like doing this, right? I mean that's actually looking and that, oh, that's a human right there, right? How often we do that? Or we slightly turn away and walk faster so we don't kind of, right? Again, prejudice, bias, right? So all in there, right? Anyways, but she does it differently, right? She talks to them and she meets a bunch of them and she started to actually work with them to, help them in true kindness, right? Without any prejudice or bias, right? And there's this example of this guy called Raimundo. Raimundo, he's a poet, right? He lives on the streets for like a long time, and every time someone helps him, he gives back like a piece of paper, right? And most people actually don't even know what's in that paper or don't get it, right? Don't touch it, right? And there's a story about this very wealthy man that comes in a big, like a driver with a big fancy car, delivers like some food to the guy, but doesn't touch the paper because he was scared or like disgust about touching the paper that the guy was touching. So see how the connection between charity, kindness is kind of strange, right? Because he was doing in a way to justify his own prejudice, right? Say, oh, I'm doing something. But reality is like energetically speaking, spiritually speaking, he was distancing himself more and more, right? From that act. Anyways, it's a very philosophical concept. But anyways, we don't have time for that. But let's go back to the story. So he was helping and he was giving these pieces of paper. And then she meets him and talks to them and get the paper. It's actually a poem. So she reads it and she asks, oh, can I say it out loud? And she recites the poem back to him, right? And started that relationship. So she was so touched by it because the guy was, he showered 2 times in 10 years. So you get the concept what we're looking at, right? And then she runs an advertising company, and her husband, I think, has some sort of psychology background or something. And they decided to actually disconnect the image and the text, the poem, right? So they got their poems published on a Facebook page, right? Under another, banner or something, right? They got 200,000 likes out of the poems that he was creating, right? And then they connect the story and all of that. So they create like a whole story, a whole concept, right? And a publicity side of things. Like Raquel's looking at me, like, I know that. Like, and the guy becomes like a viral sensation, right? Now people come all over the world to take a picture with the guy that most people will actually walk by and not care, right? A week ago, right? What changed, right? What was the change? It's the same guy, right? Same guy, same location, street address, right? Right there, sitting on the sidewalk, right? The only thing that changed is how we perceive the situation in our brains. Our whole idea of stereotyping, bias, and prejudice got this shock in 2 seconds because we looked at the result of that individual, the productivity from a poetry side of things, and that offset the disgust they had about him being on the street. It completely disconnected the two things. It's a huge living experiment of what those concepts mean, right? And then not only that, she continues and she reconnects him with his family in Goiás, my home state, right? And he did have a family, right? And they're able to sort it out. Now he goes through a period of adaptation, living in a place again, because he lived for so many years in the streets. He didn't really know how to live indoors again, right? So they did that. And then finally he went back to his family, and now he leaves off his poetry, right? And the funny thing that the author Goldberg describes is that he was living in an area of Sao Paulo that is well known for offices and stuff, and most of the book publishers were actually in the same area. And here's a man, and he didn't want food or money. He just wanted someone to look at his poetry. That's all he was. That's why he would give back as a thank you, like a little poem handwritten on a piece of paper, right? How incredible that is, right? And then she does that, Shayla, with a number of people, right? And that's why he starts to think about the idea of kindness being such that is this internal mechanism, right? That is hard to explain, but it comes such naturally when you're able to get rid of the prejudice, bias, and misconceptions and discrimination that we have. Right? When we're able to wipe some of that, she did that by taking his image out and putting a poem back, right? The same person, same thing. But she created that disconnect that our brains are like, whoa, give me a second, what's going on here? I can't see, this can't happen, right? That happens every day, right? It doesn't need to be with the homeless. It could be anywhere, in any scenario, in any time, right? But it's the same idea. So the question then from Spiritism is, what is the effort we're doing? That's what Kardec words now. What is the effort we're doing for that moral transformation? What? Right? Shayla gave us an example of it, right? But we here, like we, society, and individuals, what are the efforts are we actually putting in place to overcome that, right? And say, you know what? I actually got to do something, right? I think I'm going to end there, but I think that's the message that I want to bring today about the concept of kindness. Okay? Thank you, guys. Any questions? Oh, yeah. Daniel has a question. Go ahead, buddy.
I didn't understand fully what was bias.
Bias. Okay, so bias is when you start to treat... so first of all, you create these categories in your mind about the way you see people, right?
Oh, okay.
So that's the first step, right? And then you assign some values or predispositions or ideas about that category, right? Let's say I have green balls and blue balls, right? I put them in 2 bins, right? I look at the green balls. For some reasons that doesn't make sense. I say green balls are smaller, they smell bad, or I don't know, I don't like being beside small balls, green balls, okay? So the green balls has some prejudice, right? Because I assign like a negativity to it. But it's not biased yet because I didn't do anything with them, right? But now I take that prejudice and I say, well, now all of a sudden I'm going to take these green balls and I'm going to take them away and put them over there, right? So no one can see the green balls again. So now I'm acting unbiased because I'm treating the green and the blue balls differently, right? And then all of a sudden, I can take the green balls and say, you know what? I'm going to destroy all the green balls because they're bad, right? That's when you start to discriminate, right? Your actions turn into a negative consequence for the green balls. Got it?
Got it.
Awesome. Yes.
So, like great talk, first of all.
Oh,
Like
thank
that's
you.
phenomenal. Like
Yeah.
I'm a researcher myself as
There
well.
you
So
go.
like bringing the research in,
Yeah.
like always amazes me.
Yeah.
I do the same thing when I'm doing my studies.
Yeah.
But one thing that I would like to add to your
Yeah.
talk, it's because like, well, it looks like you have like some sort of like psychology degree.
Not really. I'm a dentist, but
Oh, you're a dentist.
Yeah.
Okay. Human health.
I pretend to do something about it.
Human health area. Yeah.
Yes.
But since you cited like multiple
Yeah.
studies in psychology,
Yeah.
I would like to bring that back.
Yeah.
In the case that like biases
Yeah.
exist
Yeah.
not only in human societies,
Oh, yeah.
right? Like there are
Yes.
multiple studies
Yeah.
that like of different kinds of animals
Yeah.
that live in some sort of a societal organization
Yeah.
in which biases is observed
Yeah.
in animals as well. So like the first point about like we having biases is that like biases are natural.
Yeah.
They come up as a mechanism of protection.
Mhm.
So like since he talked about this the study with rats, why are we disgusted by street rats, right?
Yeah.
Because they're associated with diseases that killed a bunch, like thousands, millions of people in the past, right? Like Black Plague is one of the examples. So like that's the reason. So like basically being biased, having this biased idea towards the street rats is actually a mechanism, like a defense mechanism. So like the problem is not having bias,
Mhm.
the problem is not thinking about them and trying to correct for them.
Yeah.
Right. So, and only after we can actually like realize that we have biases and it's natural to have biases, it's the point that like we are actually open to think, reflect, and change like our actions, how we act about that.
Yeah,
so don't think that like just to wrap up, like don't think that like having bias is a bad thing. And no, I'm a good person, and because I'm a good person I don't have biases. No, I have biases, but I'm able to reflect, I'm able to correct for them and act differently about my biases.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's it's a great point, because we all have it. It's just acting on that in a way that negatively change outcomes of interactions. That's exactly when the problem starts, right? But knowing about them, I think that's the same point we're bringing, is that we need to know about it. Otherwise, how can we actually think about, like, how can we act on it, right? How can we change course, right? So that will be important to know. But yeah, we all have it, and we're not going to get rid of them. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Any other comments? No? All right, so thank you all very much. We're going to have our passes now, and then who's going to do the prayer? I can do the prayer. Okay, perfect. So I'll say bye-bye to our friends that are connected to us online. And thank you all for joining, and we'll continue now with our in-person and